It was the evening of May 25th, 1969, and Los Angeles was humming with its usual energy. The city was a magnet for dreamers, actors, directors, writers, and producers, all seeking their shot at greatness in the entertainment capital of the world. Among them was Richard Carver, a well-known film producer who had made a name for himself in the late 1960s with a string of successful movies that drew both critical acclaim and box office success. By all accounts, Richard was living the Hollywood dream. He was well-connected, wealthy, and at the top of his game. Yet, despite his outward success, there was something unusual about Richard. Those who worked with him described him as a man who thrived on secrecy. While other producers enjoyed the spotlight, Richard shied away from it. He was a perfectionist, known for pushing his teams hard to create the next big hit. But his more personal life was even more private. He never discussed his past, and there were no photographs of his family or personal friends hanging in his office. It was almost as if he was hiding in plain sight. In the weeks leading up to his disappearance, his behavior became increasingly erratic. Colleagues and friends noticed that Richard seemed distracted and unwell, canceling meetings at the last minute and becoming increasingly paranoid. His assistant, Julia, recalled one conversation that stood out. He said he was getting a lot of pressure, but didn't specify from whom. She later told investigators. He looked haunted, like someone who knew something was coming, something he couldn't avoid. Despite these troubling signs, Richard carried on with his work. Then, on the night of May 25, 1969, Richard Carver vanished without a trace. It was a Saturday evening when he made his last public appearance. Richard had been invited to a private dinner at the home of a fellow producer in Beverly Hills, but just a few hours before the event, he called his assistant Julia. "I'm not feeling well," Richard told her. "I think I'll stay in tonight." There was nothing in his tone that seemed particularly alarming, but Julia couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. Richard had often canceled social events, but this time felt different. There was an unease in his voice that she hadn't heard before. That night, Richard's neighbor, Robert, saw him leave the house around 8:30 p.m. Richard's black 1967 Mustang rumbled down the quiet street, disappearing into the distance. Robert, an amateur photographer, even snapped a quick photo of the car as it drove past his window. That would be the last time anyone saw Richard Carver. The next morning, when Richard's housekeeper arrived for work, she found the house exactly as it had been the day before, except for one thing. Richard was nowhere to be found. His clothes were still in the closet, his wallet and keys sat on the table where he had left them. The house was clean and undisturbed, except for the absence of the man who had lived there for years. There were no signs of struggle, no indication that he had left in a hurry. The only odd thing was the phone. It was off the hook, as if Richard had been in the middle of a conversation before he left. Worried, the housekeeper contacted the police, and an investigation into Richard's disappearance was launched. At first, authorities treated the case as one of a missing person. Given Richard's high profile, they assumed that he had either staged his own disappearance or was taking time away from the public eye. But as the days dragged on with no word from Richard and no evidence that he had left of his own accord, suspicion began to grow. Detective Maria Rodriguez, who was assigned to the case, knew something wasn't adding up. Richard had been a successful producer, but he wasn't just a man of entertainment. He was also a businessman who had made investments in various real estate properties, including a significant stake in several movie theaters across the city. Richard had always seemed to be on top of his financials, but Detective Rodriguez soon learned that his investments were more complicated than anyone had realized. He had recently been involved in a string of high-stakes deals, many of them with foreign investors whose identities were difficult to verify. The deeper Detective Rodriguez dug, the more troubling information surfaced. Richard had been meeting with a series of shadowy figures in the weeks leading up to his disappearance. One name kept cropping up in her interviews: Luca Romano. Romano was a notorious businessman with rumored ties to the Mafia, and his connections to Hollywood were said to run deep. Richard had been in regular contact with Romano, but no one could explain what kind of business they were working on together. As Detective Rodriguez continued her investigation, she found out that Richard's personal life had been just as mysterious. His former assistant, Julia, revealed that Richard had started to change in the months before he vanished. He started getting nervous about things, paranoid even, Julia recalled. He would always look over his shoulder, and he started canceling meetings with people who had been his closest allies in the industry. It was like he was pushing everyone away. Julia also mentioned that Richard had been talking about moving away, about starting fresh in a new city. But why? He had everything a man could want in Los Angeles: money, fame, influence. What could possibly make someone like Richard Carver want to leave it all behind? The police investigation, though thorough, hit a dead end. They questioned Romano, but he was careful to deny any involvement in Richard's disappearance, and with no solid evidence linking him to any wrongdoing, the case went cold. It wasn't until a year later, in 1970, that the case would take an unexpected turn. During renovations to Richard's estate, a construction crew uncovered something strange. While working on the second floor, they noticed a small, unmarked door hidden behind a bookshelf. It was an odd feature, nothing like the other walls in the mansion, which had been constructed in the same time period. The workers pried the door open, and inside, they found a small, dark room. It was hardly a room at all, more like a hidden space. There was a desk piled with papers, some photographs, and 2 old suitcases stacked in the corner. The place hadn't been touched in years, as though someone had sealed it up and forgotten about it. The police were called, and Detective Rodriguez returned to the scene. When they opened one of the suitcases, they found it stuffed with financial records, contracts, and business papers. But the most interesting item they found was a picture, a photograph of Richard Carver with Luca Romano standing together in front of a private jet. It wasn't just a casual shot. The 2 men were smiling and shaking hands, but there was something about the way they stood that made it seem off. The back of the photo had a handwritten note in Richard's handwriting. "If anything happens to me, follow the trail to Romano. He's not what he seems." The discovery sent shockwaves through the investigation. Richard had known something was wrong. He had left a clue behind, one that could possibly explain what had happened to him. Romano, the man everyone had suspected but had never been able to pin down, was at the center of it all. As the investigation into Richard's disappearance continued, the pieces slowly began to fall into place. What had started as a simple missing persons case was quickly turning into something far darker. There were whispers of illegal business dealings, shady connections, and a hidden underworld that stretched far beyond the film industry. But despite these revelations, Richard Carver remained missing, his fate a mystery that had yet to be unraveled. 56 years had passed since Richard Carver vanished without a trace, and the mystery of his disappearance remained unsolved. Over the decades, the investigation into his fate had grown cold. The once vibrant Hollywood producer who had worked with the biggest names in the business was now just a name on a file, a ghost haunting the pages of old newspaper clippings. But things were about to change. In 2025, Richard's estate, now a historical landmark, was sold to a wealthy investor who wanted to restore the mansion to its former glory. The property, located in the heart of Beverly Hills, had remained untouched for years, its secrets buried beneath layers of dust and time. No one had bothered to go inside for decades, at least no one with the intent of truly investigating the house. The new owner, a man named Alan Weston, wanted to breathe new life into the mansion, preserving its history but modernizing it for luxury living. As the renovation began, the crew discovered something odd in the second-floor hallway. Small, unmarked door hidden behind a bookshelf. It was a strange feature. No one remembered seeing this door during previous inspections of the mansion. The design of the house was intricate, but this hidden door had been carefully concealed, as if someone had gone to great lengths to make sure it stayed unnoticed. At first, the workers thought it might be a storage closet or an old maintenance room, but when they tried to open the door, they realized it was locked, and not in a typical way. It was as if the door hadn't been opened in years, decades even. The wood was warped, the paint chipped, and the hinges seemed rusty, suggesting it hadn't been disturbed for a long time. Curious, Alan Weston ordered the crew to break the lock. What they found behind that false door would set off a chain of events that no one could have predicted. Inside, they discovered a small, dimly lit room. It was a hidden space, barely large enough to fit a desk and a few shelves. The room was filled with dust, but it was clear that someone had sealed it off long ago. There was no sign of recent activity, just the eerie stillness of a place forgotten by time. The most unusual part of the room was the furniture. A heavy wooden desk sat in the center, piled high with papers, old files, and stacks of yellowing documents. 2 large suitcases were neatly stacked in the corner, looking as though they had been placed there with careful precision. The entire room felt like a snapshot of the past, frozen in time, as if someone had disappeared without a moment's notice. But it wasn't just the physical items that made the discovery so chilling. It was the sense of something much larger, something hidden just out of view. Alan Weston, unsure of what he had stumbled upon, immediately called the authorities. Detective Jessica Lawrence, a veteran investigator who had worked on several cold cases in Los Angeles, was assigned to the scene. When Detective Lawrence arrived at the mansion, she examined the room closely. The first thing that struck her was how carefully everything had been stored. It wasn't a hoarder's den or a place hastily abandoned. The items were arranged almost methodically, in organized chaos. Whoever had hidden this room had done so with purpose. Her eyes fell on the papers scattered across the desk. Some of them were financial records, contracts, and legal documents, but others were more personal in nature. There were photographs, some of Richard Carver and others of unfamiliar people. The most puzzling photograph was one that depicted Richard standing next to a man named Luca Romano, the notorious businessman whose name had come up during the original investigation into Richard's disappearance decades earlier. The photo was strange. Richard and Luca Romano were shaking hands in front of a private jet, smiling as if they were old friends. But there was something unsettling about the way they posed together. It wasn't just a casual photograph. There was an underlying tension, a sense of unease that seemed to leap off the page. The back of the photo was inscribed with a note in Richard's handwriting: "If anything happens to me, follow the trail to Romano. He's not what he seems." Detective Lawrence's heart skipped a beat. This was no ordinary discovery. Richard Carver had left a clue behind, one that had been hidden away for more than 50 years. The note was clear. Romano was involved in something dark, something that had led to Richard's disappearance. As the detective carefully examined the rest of the room, she opened one of the suitcases. Inside, she found more financial papers, documents related to investments in Hollywood and various real estate properties around Los Angeles. Some of the names listed were well known in the entertainment industry, but others were connected to criminal enterprises and underground operations. The more she flipped through the pages, the clearer it became that Richard had been tangled in something far more dangerous than anyone had ever imagined. For years, Richard had kept his secrets close, but in this hidden room, he had left a trail that led straight to Luca Romano and, possibly, to the very reason he had vanished all those years ago. Detective Lawrence's mind raced. The pieces of the puzzle were slowly falling into place, but they didn't form a complete picture. Not yet. She would have to dig deeper, connect the dots, and uncover the truth behind Richard Carver's disappearance once and for all. The revelation was nothing short of shocking. Richard had been a man who lived in the shadows, playing a dangerous game with dangerous people. The question now was not just where Richard had gone, but why he had vanished in the first place. What had he uncovered? What was the connection between Richard Carver and Luca Romano? With this new lead, the case was far from closed. In fact, it was only just beginning. The hidden room was a key, but it was only one part of a much larger mystery, one that spanned decades and touched the lives of some of Hollywood's most powerful figures. And as Detective Lawrence stood in the dimly lit room, staring at the evidence Richard had left behind, she realized that the answers she sought might be even darker than she had ever imagined. Detective Jessica Lawrence spent the following days combing through the contents of the hidden room. Each document, each photograph, felt like another piece of Richard Carver's secret life, a life no one had fully understood. As she went through the stacks of financial records and papers, a chilling realization set in. Richard Carver had been involved in something far more sinister than anyone had ever guessed. The first major breakthrough came when Detective Lawrence found a list of names. Some were well-known figures in the film industry, others were names she didn't recognize. But one stood out to her: Luca Romano, the notorious businessman who had long been suspected of shady dealings in Hollywood. The connection was clear now. Romano had been part of Richard's life, and that life was anything but ordinary. But it wasn't just Romano's name that was on the list. There were other figures whose reputations were murky at best. There were politicians, foreign investors, and even a few names that had been linked to organized crime. It was as if Richard had been working in the shadows of Hollywood, financing films and real estate projects that were fronts for far darker activities. What had started as an investigation into a missing person was now becoming something much bigger. Detective Lawrence sat down at the desk, staring at the photo of Richard and Luca Romano. The photo was more than just a snapshot of two men smiling in front of a private jet. There was something in their eyes, an unspoken understanding, maybe even a shared secret. It was clear from Richard's note on the back of the photo that he had been trying to warn someone, maybe even himself. "If anything happens to me, follow the trail to Romano. He's not what he seems." The detective knew that she couldn't just let the mystery rest there. There were too many unanswered questions. What had Richard discovered? What had he gotten involved in? And why did he believe that Luca Romano was the key to everything? Determined to find answers, Detective Lawrence turned her attention back to the suitcases. She opened the second one, carefully sifting through the contents. This suitcase was filled with more personal papers, letters, old notes, and a few documents that seemed to detail meetings Richard had attended. Some were business-related, but others were strange, even cryptic. They looked like meeting notes for high-stakes negotiations, many of them written in a language that wasn't English. The foreign language only deepened the mystery. One document in particular caught her eye: a handwritten contract detailing an agreement between Richard and a foreign investor. The contract was vague, but hinted at a major deal involving properties in Los Angeles and overseas. The more Detective Lawrence read, the more it became clear that Richard's empire wasn't just about films and real estate. It was about something much larger, something international in scope. As she studied the contract, something strange clicked in her mind. Richard had been known to take great care with his business dealings. He'd built a reputation for being a perfectionist, a man who made sure every detail was covered. But this document was different. It was messy, rushed, and the names were partially redacted. This wasn't just a bad deal. This was something much more dangerous. And Richard had gotten caught in the middle of it. The detective decided it was time to investigate the people listed in the papers. She started with the foreign investor mentioned in the contract, someone named Aldo Greco. The name sounded familiar, but she couldn't place it. She made a note to dig deeper into Greco's background, but first, there was something else she had to do. She had to confront Luca Romano. Romano had long been a figure in the shadows of Hollywood. His name had surfaced repeatedly during the original investigation into Richard's disappearance, but with no solid evidence to link him to any wrongdoing, the authorities had been unable to do anything. But now, with the new evidence from the hidden room, things were different. Detective Lawrence knew she needed answers from Romano, answers that could lead her to the truth about Richard's disappearance. She tracked him down to one of his many luxury properties in Los Angeles. Romano was an imposing figure, a man whose presence filled the room the moment he entered. His reputation for being ruthless preceded him. The detective wasn't sure what kind of man she was dealing with, but she knew this would be no ordinary interview. Romano greeted her with his usual cold charm, his voice smooth like silk. "Detective Lawrence," he said with a smirk, "I've heard you've been busy lately. I can't imagine what's keeping you up at night, but I'm sure it's not my business." But Lawrence wasn't intimidated. She cut straight to the point. "I need to talk about Richard Carver," she said, watching closely for his reaction. Romano's face tightened for just a moment before he regained his composure. "Richard Carver," he repeated, his voice laced with disdain. "It's been years, hasn't it? You're still digging into that?" "I found something recently," the detective said, sliding the photograph of Richard and Romano across the table. "You and Richard, this was taken before he disappeared. There's something you're not telling me, Romano. What was going on between you two?" Romano's eyes flicked to the photo, then back to Lawrence. For a moment, it seemed like he might say something, but instead, he simply leaned back in his chair. Richard was complicated. He had big ideas, big dreams, but he was also a man with a lot of enemies. If you're looking for answers, you might want to dig deeper, but be careful, detective. Some doors are better left closed. The warning was clear, but it only fueled Lawrence's determination. She wasn't about to back down now. Richard Carver had left clues behind, and she was going to follow them, no matter where they led. As she left Romano's mansion, the weight of his words lingered in her mind. But there was one thing she knew for sure. Richard Carver had been involved in something much darker than Hollywood glamour, and Luca Romano was the key to unlocking it all. The detective had a choice to make. She could follow the trail and risk her career, or she could walk away and let the past stay buried. But with the pieces falling into place, there was no turning back now. Detective Jessica Lawrence couldn't shake the weight of Luca Romano's warning. Some doors are better left closed. The words kept echoing in her mind. She wasn't sure if Romano had been trying to intimidate her, or if there was something deeper he was hiding. Either way, she couldn't stop now. She had uncovered too much, and the deeper she dug, the more it seemed that Richard Carver's disappearance wasn't just a personal tragedy. It was the tip of a much larger, more dangerous iceberg. The next day, Lawrence set out to learn more about Aldo Greco, the foreign investor whose name had appeared in Richard's papers. The contract she'd found in the hidden room was a puzzle, a tangled web of international deals, incomplete contracts, and hastily redacted names. It was obvious that Richard had been involved in something far more sinister, but how deep did it go? Greco's name was tied to several offshore accounts, and the more Lawrence searched, the more she began to uncover a pattern: real estate properties, business ventures in Los Angeles, and a network of shell companies. It wasn't just about money, it was about control. Greco's investments seemed to overlap with Richard's projects, but there was one key difference. Where Richard saw opportunity, Greco saw leverage. Lawrence's investigation led her to a nondescript office building in downtown Los Angeles. It wasn't the kind of place you'd expect to find an international businessman. It was dark, tucked away between two much grander buildings. Inside, the fluorescent lights hummed, and the air felt stale, like no one had bothered to care about the place in years. Her target? A former associate of Greco's named Victor Lanza. Lanza had been involved in several real estate deals with Greco, and he had once worked closely with Richard Carver. According to her research, Lanza was now on the run, a fugitive who had vanished shortly after Richard's disappearance. There was no telling where he might be now, but Lawrence was determined to find him. As she walked into the building's lobby, she felt a cold sense of urgency. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up as she approached the receptionist. Without even mentioning Lanza's name, she could sense something was off. The woman behind the desk didn't look like she belonged there. Her eyes darted around the room nervously, and when Lawrence flashed her badge, the receptionist's face turned pale. I don't know anything about him," the receptionist stammered. I haven't seen him for years." Before Lawrence could ask another question, the woman looked down, fidgeting with a pen, avoiding eye contact. It wasn't the response Lawrence had expected. Something wasn't right. Suddenly, the room went silent. Lawrence's instincts kicked in. She turned around just in time to see two men in dark suits enter the building through the side door. They moved quickly, purposefully, and neither of them seemed to take notice of her presence until one of them made eye contact. A chill ran through her. The man's gaze was cold, calculating. For a brief moment, he didn't look like a man at all, more like a predator sizing up his prey. Before Lawrence could react, the two men disappeared down the hallway, leaving her standing there, unsure of what to do next. She had to follow them, there was no doubt about it. But as she made her way toward the hallway, her phone buzzed in her pocket. It was a message from her superior. "You need to stop, Jessica. You're getting too close." The words hit her like a slap to the face. Was this a warning? Or was someone trying to scare her off? Either way, she wasn't going to back down. Lawrence followed the two men into the building's dark corridor, her heart racing. She reached the door at the end of the hall, the one that led to the stairwell. The men were gone, but there was still something strange about the scene. She pushed the door open, finding herself on the roof of the building. There was nothing but a few industrial air conditioning units and the distant hum of the city below. But then, she noticed something. Two figures standing near the edge, talking quietly. One of them was Victor Lanza. Before she could make a move, a sharp voice cut through the air. "What are you doing here, detective?" She turned to see Luca Romano standing in the doorway. He was calm, too calm, his expression unreadable. Lawrence's stomach dropped. Romano had been trailing her. "You didn't really think I'd let you dig into Richard Carver's past without consequences, did you?" Romano's voice was smooth, but carried an unmistakable edge. "You're getting too close, Jessica. People like you don't belong in the world I operate in." Lawrence stood her ground, trying to steady her breath. She had come this far, and she wasn't backing down now. "What happened to Richard Carver, Romano? What's the real story? You know what I'm talking about." Romano's smile was cold, but it didn't reach his eyes. "You think Richard was just some innocent producer? That's cute. Richard knew the risks, Jessica. He played the game and got burned. But some games are too dangerous to win." Before Lawrence could respond, a loud bang echoed from the street below, a sharp metallic sound that seemed to shake the air itself. Romano didn't flinch, but Lawrence instinctively ducked. The two men on the rooftop were now gone, disappearing into the shadows. The silence that followed was suffocating. "What was that?" Lawrence whispered, her mind racing. Romano didn't answer immediately. His eyes narrowed, and he stepped closer. "You don't want to know," he said, his tone lower now. "Some things are better left buried." He turned, disappearing down the stairwell, leaving Lawrence standing on the roof, uncertain and more afraid than ever. Had she just uncovered something she wasn't supposed to? The warning signs were all there. This was no longer just about a missing man. It was about survival. For the first time since she started investigating, Detective Lawrence felt the weight of danger hanging over her. She didn't know who to trust anymore. Was Romano truly trying to protect her, or was he just trying to keep her from unraveling the truth? And who were the men she had seen with Lanza? What did they want from her? As she stood there, looking down at the city, Lawrence realized the mystery was no longer just about Richard Carver. The stakes had changed. Whatever dark forces had pulled Richard into their web were still out there, and now they were watching her too. Detective Jessica Lawrence didn't sleep that night. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Luca Romano's face, the calm, calculating expression, the warning in his voice. Some things are better left buried. The words had burrowed deep into her mind, but as much as they haunted her, she couldn't let them stop her. She had come too far, and there was something she still didn't understand, something about Richard Carver's disappearance that wasn't adding up. The next morning, her phone buzzed again. It was a text from her partner, Tom. "I've got something. Meet me at the office. It's big." When she arrived at the station, Tom was waiting for her in his usual seat at the far end of the bullpen. He didn't look up as she entered, his eyes glued to the computer screen in front of him. But when she sat down, he finally spoke, his voice low and tense. "I found something," he said, turning the screen toward her. On the monitor was a series of photographs, grainy, taken from a distance, but they were unmistakable. Victor Lanza, Aldo Greco, and Richard Carver. The photos were from years ago, but they showed something that took Lawrence's breath away. The three men were standing in front of a warehouse in downtown Los Angeles. They were talking, laughing even, but there was a tension in the air, something unspoken. The most chilling part of the photos? In the background, a shadowy figure lurked, watching them closely. Someone who had been there all along, pulling the strings. "Who is that?" Lawrence asked, pointing to the figure. Tom's fingers hovered over the keyboard as he did a quick search. His face grew pale. "It's him. Luca Romano." The name hit her like a ton of bricks. "Wait, what do you mean?" Lawrence asked, trying to make sense of it. Romano wasn't just a businessman. He was running the show. He's been hiding in plain sight all this time. Look at these photos closely. Tom zoomed in. "There's more. See the license plate on the car in the background? It's linked to a private airstrip just outside the city." Lawrence's mind raced. The pieces were finally falling into place. Romano, Lanza, Greco. These weren't just men involved in shady business deals. They were all connected to something far darker. And Richard Carver had been right at the center of it. The private airstrip was a clue. If it was tied to Romano, it meant they were moving something or someone out of Los Angeles. Lawrence didn't waste another second. "We need to go there, right now." The drive to the private airstrip was a blur. Detective Jessica Lawrence's thoughts were racing. Each twist in the case, each discovery, had led her to this moment. The photos of Richard Carver, Victor Lanza, and Aldo Greco standing in front of a warehouse, with Luca Romano lurking in the background, had shattered everything she thought she knew. Romano wasn't just a businessman. He was the mastermind behind a sprawling network of illegal deals. And Richard Carver had been entangled in it all. But what did it mean for her? Was she simply a pawn in a much larger game? And why had Richard, a man who had seemed so focused on his films, gotten involved in something so dark? Lawrence knew she had to find the answers. When she arrived at the airstrip, the cold night air hit her face. The place was quiet, almost too quiet. The hangar loomed in front of her, dark and imposing. She motioned for Tom to stay back as she approached the building. Every instinct told her to be cautious. They slipped inside, the dim light flickering overhead. The smell of oil and old metal filled the air. It was exactly as she had imagined, somewhere no one should be. She could hear muffled voices from deeper inside. As they rounded the corner, they saw two men unloading something from the back of a large truck, boxes stacked high, their contents hidden by thick tarp. Lawrence and Tom exchanged a glance. It was the same feeling again, the one from the warehouse photos. This was it. The operation she had been chasing was right in front of her. Before they could get closer, Lawrence froze. The sound of footsteps echoed down the hallway, and two men in black suits emerged, walking toward them with an air of confidence as if they owned the place. Romano's men. "Detective," one of them sneered, recognizing her instantly. "You've really dug too deep this time. This ends here." Lawrence's hand went instinctively to her holster, but before she could draw her weapon, the unmistakable voice of Luca Romano rang out from behind them. "Let her be." Lawrence spun around. There he was, Romano, standing in the doorway, flanked by his usual bodyguards. His calm expression never wavered, but his eyes were sharp, like a predator assessing its prey. "Romano," she said through clenched teeth, "this ends tonight. What is all of this? What are you really running here?" Romano's lips twisted into a cold smile. "You're still playing detective, Jessica? You've stumbled onto something far bigger than you can understand. But I'll indulge you." He motioned for his men to step back. "What you're looking at here isn't just about drugs or money. It's about control, about power over an empire that stretches from Hollywood to places you can't even begin to imagine." He awed and stepped forward, his voice dropping low. Richard Carver was a tool. He thought he could play with the big boys. But when he started to dig, he dug too deep. He learned too much, and that's why he had to go. Lawrence's heart pounded in her chest. "You killed him." Romano's eyes flickered for a brief moment, but he quickly regained his composure. "I didn't kill him. He made a choice. He walked away from the game. But the game doesn't let you walk away, Jessica. Not when you've seen too much." He paused, almost as if savoring the moment. "Richard thought he could expose us, but all he did was expose himself. And you, Jessica? You're walking down the same path. You think you're going to bring me down? You think you're going to save Hollywood from people like me?" "I'm not trying to save Hollywood," Lawrence shot back. "I'm trying to bring you down, and I will, no matter the cost." Romano chuckled darkly. "You have no idea what you're dealing with. This isn't just about me. This is about a network that stretches across countries, governments, entertainment industries, even law enforcement. You can't stop this, Jessica. You'll only make it worse." Before Lawrence could respond, the sound of engines roaring to life interrupted the conversation. She turned to see several black SUVs speeding down the airstrip, headlights cutting through the dark. Romano's face tightened, his eyes flashed in a sudden panic. "We need to go, now." Lawrence didn't wait. She turned and ran, Tom close behind. As they sprinted toward the exit, a shout echoed from behind them. "You won't escape, detective!" Romano's voice was laced with fury. The two agents reached the fence at the end of the airstrip and jumped into their car just as the first SUV came into view. Tires screeched as they tore out of the parking lot, just barely avoiding the approaching vehicles. As they sped down the road, the weight of the situation finally hit Lawrence. Romano's power was far-reaching. He had people everywhere. The network he controlled wasn't just about money. It was a system that influenced the very fabric of society. And Richard Carver had been caught in it, just like everyone else. "We need to get to the station, fast," Lawrence said, her voice tight with urgency. Tom nodded. "I'll get us there, but we need backup, and we need to call in the feds. This goes way beyond us now." By the time Lawrence and Tom returned to the station, the pieces of the puzzle had come together. Romano's network had been more than just a business operation. It was a well-oiled machine that manipulated everything from Hollywood's biggest productions to international politics. They were moving money, drugs, and people across borders. The key to the operation was not just the illegal profits, but the control it exerted over global systems. The feds had already raided Romano's properties and arrested several of his associates, but it didn't stop there. The investigation revealed that Aldo Greco and Victor Lanza were at the heart of the international trafficking ring, using their connections in entertainment and real estate to cover their operations. Richard Carver, it turned out, had been more than just a victim. He had been a whistleblower, a man who had tried to expose the conspiracy before it consumed him. His mysterious disappearance had been orchestrated by Romano and his men, but Carver had left behind a trail of evidence, documents, photographs, and contracts that would ultimately be his legacy. And it was this evidence that had brought Romano down. Months later, after the dust had settled, Lawrence stood at the memorial for Richard Carver. The man who had once been Hollywood's golden boy, now remembered as a tragic figure who had tried to expose the truth. The film industry mourned his loss, but in reality, few knew the full story. It was a story buried under the layers of fame, glamour, and lies that Hollywood was built on. But Lawrence knew the truth. She had uncovered the darkness that had consumed Richard's life and nearly consumed her own. As the sun set over the Los Angeles skyline, Lawrence reflected on everything she had learned. She had lost friends, made enemies, and discovered a side of the world that few people ever saw. But at the end of the day, she had done what she set out to do. She had brought justice to Richard Carver, and that was enough.